We are live.
Hello, everyone. Loss of Puneet Rajkumar, who was so talented and young, energetic, has been a huge loss to the film industry. We at Mysuru Literature Festival postponed a panel which was prior to this in respect to the Kannada film industry. Rest in peace, Puneet. You will be missed forever. A warm welcome to our viewers on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Shubha Sanjayars, the chairperson and the director of Mysuru Literature Festival. A warm welcome to you, Avinuo and Jayashree.
Hello.
Avinuo is a writer and teacher from Kohima, Nagaland. She has contributed to various literary journals. She has authored The Power to Forgive and Other Stories, Zuban, The Last Light of Glory Days and Other Stories by Speaking Tiger, a collection of poetry where wildflowers grow, and co-authored an anthology of oral narratives titled Naga Heritage Center, People's Stories, Volume 1. Avinuo holds a PhD in English literature. Now moving on to our own Jayashree Jagannatha. Jayashree Jagannatha, she is a member of Mysuru Book Clubs, which was established in 2015. She is a person of varied talent. She is a qualified French teacher and a translator-interpreter. She has assisted and is assisting in several scholars and filmmakers such as Eliza, filmmaker from Canada, Dr. John Brem, agricologist, UK, Zach Miller, filmmaker from USA, Project Disha, a community research project in collaboration with Ashodaya, Mysore, and the University of Manitoba. Dr. Robert Lorway, Department of Anthropology and University of Manitoba, and several others she has worked with. In addition, she has designed and taught short courses in conversational French and has worked as a volunteer consultant to a NGO to impart computer-aided English education to rural students. She also pitches to our story narrating sessions at orphanages, which is initiated by Mysuru Literature Festival. She is a solid backbone and a strength which we are very proud of. Thank you, Jayashree, for ever standing by us. A warm welcome to all our viewers. Alka Joshi has just joined us. Good morning to you, Alka.
Good morning.
Yeah. Alka, a brief about Alka. Alka Joshi was born in India and was raised in US since the age of 9. She has a bachelor's degree from Stanford University and a master's in fine arts from California College of Arts. Joshi's debut novel, The Henna Artist, became a New York Times bestseller and is being developed into a limited TV series. The sequel, The Secret Keeper of Jaipur, released in June 2021, will be followed by a third book in trilogy in 2023. Congratulations to all this. And there's so much more coming up about both the authors, which Jayashree is going to bring it out. So a warm welcome to our panelists and our moderator and all our viewers, trustees and book club members, and our viewers who are watching on YouTube and Facebook. Please like and subscribe for our channel. Please leave your questions in the chat box. Our tech team will transfer them to the moderator. The screen is all yours.
Hello, Namaskara from Mysuru, and good evening, good morning, Alka. Good evening, Avinuo. We are very fortunate to have you both here. With your debut novels and books, you have scaled phenomenal heights. And Alka, though she lives in California, she has brought stories from Rajasthan all the pinks and colors from Rajasthan with henna. And Avinuo brings the stories from Nagaland and its forests and greens, and we are converging in Mysuru with its golden glow of Dasara. We just finished it. So we called it Multi-hued Tales. The other thing I noticed with your stories is that traditionally, even in mythologies, it has been common to set a woman's story, you need the framework of a man's story. To tell a woman's story, generally it is set in a man's story. But you both, your stories stand on their own. Our friend mentioned that you give autonomy to women's points of view, and they're like any people's stories. And before I ask you questions and get some very insights into your writing, I would like to give a brief outline of your story so that the viewers will know what we are talking about. Alka, you wrote Henna Artist, followed by Secret Creep. Yeah, and it's going to be a Netflix serial. And you're on the second sequel, which is your third book. You are researching to write it, I hear. Yeah. In your story, it starts in a tiny village, and it starts just before independence with the protagonist Lakshmi, a Dalit girl from a very poor family. The father is a disillusioned drunkard, independence fighter, freedom fighter, and she follows an old man who does miniatures. She helps him in mixing colors, and he does miniatures on skeletons of people trees, and that's how she gets his skill. And later she's forced into a child marriage, abusive child marriage, where every day she wakes up bruised and bloody. That's what you write. And she lives with her mother-in-law, who is a healer, a herbal healer. She has the knack of giving medicines and healing and solving problems of women, like contraceptives and whatnot. She gets that skill, runs away. As an adolescent, she's in the pleasure district of Agra, where courtesans from Turkey, Tajikistan, they have these exotic henna making skills, which they teach her. And with all these skills, she becomes invaluable for a man who wants his mistresses to not get pregnant, and he brings her to Jaipur. And there she buries and hides her past and becomes Lakshmi Shastri, the henna artist. And she has a dream of coming up in life, making enough money, build a home of her own, and go back and help her family. And she's almost there, and she gets she becomes the most in-demand henna artist of Jaipur elite society. And when she even gets an entry to the royal household, and her whole plan comes tumbling down. And there comes the husband towing behind him a little girl, chit of a girl who is her younger sister, and all her problems begin again. Will she, and how she will build back her life, and the thrill that follows. That's your story. And Avinuo, you bring us stories from Kohima and Nagaland. Your stories almost start just after the Second World War, some of them. I group them as three generally in big classification. Like, you write stories about anti-establishment and problems of frontier states which lie, and indigenous people who lie between two big power countries, and the fights and conflicts. That's one set of stories. The other one, you handle delicate intimate relationships and abuse of young girls with family members, older family members, tutors, touching young girls, and one kind of human relationship. And third was stories of the forest and nature, the last sambar, which is going to be extinct, and it's shot by a hunter, and forest myths and very mystical forests. That becomes a personality in your stories. So with this introduction, I think I'll start the questions. And first couple of questions, I would like to ask common questions to you both. The first one is, how did you become a writer? When did you decide to be a writer? What motivated you to be a writer? And were you trained as a writer, or was it an inner calling that you answered to? We would like to know about the journey. Shall we start with you, Alka?
Sure. I never intended to become a writer. It wasn't in my journey. It wasn't something that I did from a little girl. I wasn't inventing stories about people. I wanted to be an artist. I drew and I sketched and I painted, and I thought, I just want to be in the arts in some way. And when I went for my first advertising job, my intention was to become an art director. That's what I asked my interviewers to, consider me for. And they said, well, they looked at my portfolio and they said, did you write everything? Did you write the headlines? Did you write the body copy? And I said, yes, I did. And they said, well, then why don't you want to be a writer? I said, because I want to be an art director. And they said, listen, we have a position available for a junior copywriter, and we will try you out for 30 days. And you can tell us at the end of 30 days if you like writing, because we think you're going to make it, but we'll also let you know whether we like your writing. So at the end of 30 days, I realized I actually really did enjoy writing and creating commercials. That was fun for me. And I did get to use my artistic talent and my ability to imagine and visualize a lot of different scenes. And I got to write dialogue, which I'd never written before. So I was successful at it. And then I think ever since then, I was just writing commercials and advertising materials and marketing materials. And then my husband kept saying, I think that you can write fiction. I think you should try your hand at long form fiction. I said, what makes you say that? He said, because when we go out to dinner, you make up stories about the people sitting next to us. So maybe you should try doing that formally. And that's when I enrolled in an MFA program, so the Masters of Fine Arts program in creative writing. And I learned how to write a novel and how to sustain that tension throughout 400 pages. I'd only been writing commercials that were like half a minute or a minute each. So that's how I started writing The Henna Artist. But then it would take me another 10 years to actually bring it to publication.
That's very interesting to hear. Avinuo, I'm curious to know what made you start writing.
Becoming a writer and the journey towards getting published for me happened quite by chance, like Alka as well. I don't think I can recall a singular moment that a conscious, deliberate decision was taken. It was a gradual, unconscious process, a journey beginning with a love for listening to stories and then telling stories, reading, a love for books, writing stories, all these being interrelated. Storytelling, particularly oral storytelling, it's such a huge part of my Naga heritage. And I've grown up listening to stories, and it felt quite natural to continue the tradition of telling stories, which for me expanded to writing them as well. And I think I was about 11 or 12 years when my mother presented me with a diary. And I quickly grew bored of documenting daily life in my diary because it was just so uneventful and monotonous that I started writing little fictional stories instead. And sometimes I would share them with my family. So I think that's probably how the joy of writing stories and sharing them, I think that's how it really began. My first publisher was Zuban, and I was already, and then, after college, some years after college, my first publisher was Zuban. I was already familiar with them because of their many wonderful Nordic titles. So I very impulsively, one afternoon, unsolicited, emailed them, sent them a couple of sample stories along with a covering letter. And I was really very naive, but thankfully they replied and asking for more stories, and things just took on from there. So that's my story.
That's wonderful. I have one on Kindle and one here, your stories. And yeah, Zuban are independent feminist publishers, like they publish feminist stories as well. Yes, I know about them. My second question would be, Alka, you chose a form of writing, which is a long novel, and you followed it by a sequel, and you are writing another one. That's a huge challenge to create personalities and then make them evolve and grow and to sustain interest, even though you add new characters, but the originals They just evolve into different people. And that's a challenge. You chose that. Whereas Avinuo, you chose short stories. And it has its own challenge of being crisp and short. You also wrote poetry and you recorded the oral narratives. So that's a different genre of literature. Alka, why did you choose the long one? Why did you think that would suit anything particular? And same with Avinuo, one after the other. Please, could you tell us?
Once again, just as I'm an accidental writer, I'm an accidental trilogy writer, because I think the first novel took me 10 years. Now, I always had in mind what TV shows and what movies always portray, which is somebody sits down at a computer, they dash out all of their, story, and the pages fly off, and then suddenly they're being printed. And then the next thing you know, that person is at the book signing. And so I just thought that's how it would go. I would write this novel, and then that's what would happen. That did not happen because my novel was not ready to be published. I hadn't learned everything I needed to learn to sustain the reader's interest over that long form. So I went through a period of 10 years where I had many different editors, different people looking at it, telling me what they would do differently, how they would help me. And then eventually somebody sent my novel into their agent. Their agent called me and said, I'd like to represent you. And I was like, great, now I'll be published. He said, no. You have 3 more years to go before we're going to think that it's anywhere close to publication. We love the story, but you still need to learn how to be a writer of stories. So she worked with me for 3 years. Then I said, at what point are we going to get published? I was getting really frustrated. And she said, well, you need to hire a developmental editor. So then I hired a developmental editor. I didn't like what she told me, which is you're not ready to be published. So I hired another developmental editor who also told me the same thing. So essentially, over those 10 years, as I was working on the novel, and then before my agent finally sent it off to a publisher and then it got sold, I was living with these characters and I was getting to know them. They were on my walks with me. They were in the shower with me. They were in bed with me. They were constantly in my head. And I think that when you get to know your characters over such a long period of time, you sort of begin to think of them as your second family. And that's how I thought of these characters, so that they eventually started telling me what they wanted to do. They eventually started almost writing the scenes for me. And when I finished the henna artist and it went off to the printers, Malik, one of the characters from the henna artist, kept telling me, you need to write my story. You've already got most of the bones of it written down, the pages that didn't make it into the novel, because as you know, when you're trying to write a novel, you will overwrite it and then you will have to cut as you revise. So he said to me, you've already got my story. You know what I'm going to turn out to be as an adult. Why don't you write it? So that's when I started writing The Secret Keeper of Jaipur. And then as I wrote that, I realized that I couldn't also shoehorn Radha's story as an adult, which I had partially written. And I realized I'm going to need a third book to write her story. So that's how the trilogy came about. It wasn't something I planned. I feel like my whole life is nothing I have planned. It just sort of happens.
Good for you and good for us. Malik is a very good personality. I was happy to read about him in the sequel. Avinuo, you chose the other kind of genre of literature. Why?
Choosing the genre. I think I understand this question a little differently. When I have an idea for a story or a poem or an essay or what have you in mind, I first think about how best it can be told. So, and granted, sometimes stories and fictional characters, they have a life of their own and can surprise the writer. But for my first book, which is a collection of short stories, like you have already introduced, I had these ideas for little stories in my head. So I knew that it would be a collection of short stories. But also, at the risk of sounding a little contradictory, I don't like to constrain myself by deciding on the genre or the mode of telling prior. I love writing. So, I love writing stories and just letting my imagination run loose. So I just start writing and allow the story to and the characters to breathe, to the tale to unfold, and give it as much space as it needs.
That's nice. The other point I wanted to know was Alka's story starts just before independence and goes on for a few decades. And she has lived most of her life in California, as we know, but she writes about the culture and the aspects of Jaipur and the surrounding and the castes and the royal family, everything that, how did you research to get this so authentically? And Avinuo, you write about just after Second World War, which is, you're too young to actually have been writing from there till you collect the oral stories as well of the Naga people. And your stories happen in Kohima, around, in other smaller towns. And how did you pick up so many stories? Of what research did you do for that resistance against the establishment and their family stories? Alka?
So I did extensive research because one of my biggest concerns was that the South Asian audience feel that these books were authentic, that my writing was authentic about India. So one of the first things I did, of course, was interview my parents, who were born in the 30s. They were married in 1955. And subsequently, we lived in India, my brothers and I, as children, until 1966. So I still have a large part of my DNA, and my early memories are all of that period. So I was able to mine my memories, but also mine my parents' memories. And then every time I would go to Jaipur, I took about 5 trips to Jaipur while I was writing The Henna Artist. And every time I would go, I would talk to shopkeepers. I would talk to anybody in my parents' circle who was alive at that time in 1955, which is primarily when The Henna Artist then takes place. And I also did things like I went to the MGD school in Jaipur and talked to the principal about what it was like for the Maharani to set up that school, and what it was like for the girls when they were studying there, because she herself had been a student at that time. So I learned a lot about that. Then, of course, I read books. I read a book called A Princess Remembers, which was by the Maharani Gayatri Devi of Jaipur. And it was all about life in the palace, how she had met her husband, how she had tried to modernize the women of Rajasthan with the kinds of schools that she founded and the kinds of things that she encouraged them to do. And then I read a lot of books by Indian authors. You know, South Asia has a great literary tradition, and there are so many books that have been written by Indian authors that I think bear good scrutiny throughout the world, and probably should be reprinted so that people understand what those stories are about. I also watched movies. And as we all know, Bollywood has been producing thousands of movies every year for a really long time. So I saw a couple of movies. One was Char So Bees, and it was an amazing story about the nationalizing of India after independence. The fact that Indians wanted to have they wanted to be able to make their own cars, their own clothes, their own everything, as opposed to what it had been like during the days of colonization. So I watched that movie. And then there was another movie that stood out, and it was called Mr. and Mrs. 55. And it starred Madhubala and Guru Dutt. And it was all about the divorce decree that had just been legalized, so that Hindus could finally get a divorce. And I thought it would be perfect to set the book primarily in 1955, because Lakshmi has been hiding the fact that she ran away from her marriage. She deserted her own marriage. And wouldn't it be great if she could actually legally get a divorce? So those are all the kinds of things that went into the novel. And I did a lot of research on herbal remedies, but also I used many of the things that my mother, my grandmother, and my aunts have always practiced, because all of us South Asians, we all practice home remedies, and it was so easy to incorporate them into the novel. And then again, my father speaks in proverbs. So the proverbs became a really big part of all of my novels. And I always have a lot of Indian proverbs peppered throughout, because I think they're such a unique and fascinating way of conveying a message, but in short bursts.
Yes. Your answer resonates a lot with us because as you know, Mysuru is a royal city as well. And we have Maharanis high schools and Maharanis colleges, Yuvarajas colleges, Maharajas colleges set up long ago by the erstwhile kings. So it makes, when I was reading it, it made sense that yes, education was given importance. Yes.
And Jayashree, I think that it was very important for me as somebody who lives in the West and recognizes that the West knows so little about South Asia. The West really does not have any idea of how sophisticated and how well developed South Asia was before the West was developed. I think that sometimes the West thinks that they just came along and invented everything. They have no idea of the rich heritage and the learnings that they have actually gleaned from the East. And so part of what I'm trying to impart in my novels is the education of those people in the West who know nothing about our rich heritage. And that is so important to me in these novels. And I'm glad to hear you say that, even in the Mysuru culture, it's, it resonates with you, and that even the young people in the culture are going to understand where I think their DNA comes from.
Avinuo, your perspective about the resistance which started just after the Second World War, the time, and how did you do research to collect that material?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And my stories range from the 1940s to present day. So for a lot of it, I obviously was not a witness to it. So I had to do my fair share of research. But stories set in contemporary times in urban Kohima, that's where I live, they were comparatively easier to write because I am simply writing about what I know, what my everyday reality, the world and the society that I see around me. So those were easier to write, but I obviously needed to do research for stories set against some historical backdrop, post-war, stories on conflict or involving spirits and folklore, or against a rural pastoral backdrop in the forest or valleys and etc. For all this, my research was primarily grounded on the oral tradition. It wasn't so diverse like Alka, but it was just pretty straightforward in that it was grounded on the oral tradition. And I began by consulting my parents, my aunts and uncles, then elders. I went searching for oral narrators and knowledge keepers, as we call them, and I would not have been able to write my stories without them. We Nagas, we are such a, we have such a rich oral, we are a rich oral indigenous society, and the elderly generation who have actually lived this tradition, they are such wonderful storytellers. And they are, walking libraries with their huge, not just the huge repository of life experiences, but their knowledge of history and folklore and folk tales and legends and myths and traditional wisdom and ancestral knowledge and all that. So listening to them, that was actually all the research that I needed. So yeah, I'm always on the lookout for oral narrators with my trusty recorder at hand, and I would not have been able to write my stories without the oral tradition and oral narrators. I owe them everything. Yeah.
Actually, I must say 2 points in yours, whatever you said. You said it's not so diverse. I think for us, it's as diverse as it gets, because it's such a fresh narrative that you're bringing from that Nagaland that we're not very familiar with. We're really thankful to you for bringing those stories. And the second thing, I must say very proudly that your story also resonates with us, because Mysuru, there are 2 hours away, we have forests. And there are people who live in the forest. There is a narrative of, oral narrative of songs, and there are tribal people who live in the forest closer to Mysuru. And there are lots of traditions and culture which is passed down orally. So you must come once and listen to Mysuru, just to listen to them at least. Yes. And moving on to the most favorite part of your writing for me, Alka, the most favorite part in your writing was the henna itself. As you know, traditionally, this land has an imagery communication tradition, like in tantric images, chakras, mandalas, rangolis, and all that. And you chose a new one, henna, as a communication and a therapeutic art. It's such a beautiful art. That made me read that novel with so much of fresh feeling inside me. And you make that, it's so sensuous sometimes. You you use it as a mood elevators for people, and for increasing libido of their partners. And you even write somewhere that you paint the soul of a woman, Parvati, with a wasp and a fig, and you assure, the Lakshmi assures Parvati that her husband would talk about it or notice it. And I never known that the sole of the feet were painted too. So I want to know, how did you put it into your tradition? I will tell you, Avinuo, afterward, as she answers what was the best part for me in your writing. Yes.
I have a really big imagination. And I thought that what was kind of interesting is, what if I could combine Lakshmi's 2 talents, her knowledge of herbs and what they can do to our bodies, and then also her artistic skill in henna. What if I combined those 2 and made her this extraordinary henna artist who is helping women realize their desires in ways that they don't even understand? And so I have read an article about wasps and figs, and how every fig needs to be fertilized by a certain wasp. You cannot just have one wasp go and fertilize all the figs. It requires that particular wasp to do it. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. Then I kept reading further in the article, and it said that the wasp actually dies after fertilizing. He dies in the fig, and that we end up eating a desiccated wasp. We don't taste it, but it is all inside the fig when we eat the fig. And I thought that there was something kind of sexy about that the wasp was so ecstatically happy after fertilization that this is what happened. And I thought, it's sort of like what might happen to Samir after an afternoon in bed with Parvati. So they could talk about what, Lakshmi is painting on Parvati's feet. So that's sort of how these ideas come about. The other thing I have is Kanta, who really wants a baby. And so henna, Lakshmi paints the henna with, she does this mehndi with, babies in different positions all over Kanta's belly. And I didn't even know at that time that the henna artists of today are starting to do that. They do paint pregnant bellies now. And I don't know if they used to in the 1950s, but I just sort of came up with this idea that that's what Lakshmi is doing. And then there's another scene where Lakshmi is painting the oil vendor's wife, her breasts. And this is a woman who has breastfed 3 babies. And so her breasts are sagging, but Lakshmi paints them in a way that, simulates an uplifting of the breasts. And so I have so many readers who ask me, where can I get that henna? I need that. I need that design. And I always think telling people, I go, listen, here is an idea for the entrepreneurs among you. You need to start a henna spa, similar to what Lakshmi is doing, where she's combining these two different skills, the Ayurvedic skill and the artistic skill, and being able to, service women in this way for self-care. I said, I'm giving you guys the idea. So anybody out there who wants it, you should start this now.
Like a tobacco patch or something. Enough or something. Yeah. Thank you. That was very interesting. Avinuo, the best part for me is, to quote you, you say that your stories happen between the military action and the magic. Magic for me in your stories are the mystical forests. You give them a personality. You give them a personality where it is misty, foggy, and sometimes as we read your stories, the division between living and non-living, and forest is living, of course, but as a human thing, they mix up in the among the lives of the people. For example, one expectant mother, she delivers at the edge of a forest, as though tribal women do it by themselves. You write it so naturally. She delivers a baby. She cuts a bamboo, fresh bamboo cut, you say, is supposed to be antiseptic. She cuts the umbilical cord, and she is kind of resting and sleeping, and the forest whispers in her ear about changing the name of the baby. She and her husband would have decided on a baby's name, and this one suggests another name, and the baby's personality in her mind changes once she gives in to the suggestion of the forest. And that's very interesting. It's a kind of abstract zone it takes me. And the other one, a boy comes from school and boarding school holidays, and while going fishing, he picks up a shiny thing from the river and puts it under his bed. And as long as that is there, everything starts going weird in the house. And just before he goes back to his boarding school, on the way to the bus, through the forest, he wades into the river, drops it back there and goes, and things come back to normal. In many, many ways, you mix up forest as though it's a green fog which comes into my mind. And that's the most beautiful part of your writing. Could you talk more about that forest as a personality in your stories, please?
Thank you for that really close engagement with my stories. That's so nice to hear. These stories, they are all inspired by folklore and the old traditional Naga way of life, which has always really fascinated me. A very deep consciousness, of spirit activity forms the basis of ancestral Naga spirituality, and the idea of the physical human world coexisting with the supernatural world. It was considered quite natural, and people had such a deep respect for nature. And I've always been really fascinated with these stories. So my stories are inspired by these folktales and folklores regarding the naming of the baby and all that. It's inspired by our belief. We put a lot of store in names, that you should. There have been stories about, babies falling sick because they were given the wrong names, so a ritual would be done and then the right name would be given. And so it was inspired by all this sort of old belief system, and which I've always been really fascinated with. So so my stories are inspired and reminiscent of that old way of life, which is also very quickly vanishing, sadly. So in a way, I guess I wanted to preserve a glimpse of that old world through my stories. Yeah.
Nice.
Oh, and by the way, speaking of the supernatural, I do have to say, I think this is very interesting. Every time you talk, that cricket starts talking also. And I'm hearing the cricket, it must be in your space, because it only starts talking when you talk. And I'm thinking, I think that cricket has something to say to us.
Now the topic of women in your writing. Alka, you write about your women who are who are strong yet vulnerable, who make choices of having a baby, not having a baby, aborting a baby, or having a baby out of wedlock. Different women choose different things. They are greedy, yet they don't need anybody else to solve the problem. They do suffer. It's not like suffer or find solutions themselves. And what was your inspiration to create women like that?
My whole inspiration for the henna artist and why I started writing it was really to honor my mother. My mother did not get to make all of the choices that she afforded me. So, she had an arranged marriage at 18. She was taken out of college. She never got to go back to college again. She had, by the time she was 22, she had 3 kids, usually in diapers. And, so she was constantly servicing somebody else. And my father was one of those civil engineers in the 1950s who was helping rebuild India. This was a very important part of what was happening in India. So we were constantly moving from city to city as he was posted to yet another project and another project. And my mother's life was never sort of stable in one place with her family. We were always apart from both of the families of my mother and father. And then when my father decided to get a doctorate in the United States, then my mom was responsible for moving all of us and getting us used to a whole different culture and so on. So I wanted to really respect the fact that my mother, even as an immigrant to the United States, thought to herself, I could raise my daughter very differently here. She does not have to conform to any kind of tradition. She can choose her own partner in life. She can choose her own career. She can choose whether she wants to have children or not. They don't have to be thrust upon her. And so she gave me all of those messages saying, the only thing that I require of you, Alka, is that you make sure you have a job that will sustain you. You need to support yourself financially so that you are not dependent on anybody else for that. And I really took her messages to heart. So it was very important for me in the henna artist to create that environment in which women live with all of the conditions that are thrust upon them by society. So this is what's happening in 1955. But each of these women finds a way to get agency in their life in whatever small way they can. Some of the women are super wealthy, like the Maharanis, but they still, and they have their wealth and they have their privilege, but they still do not have agency over what their husbands decide about the future of their own children. And then we have the poor servants like Lala and the young girl who gets impregnated by Ravi. And those women have absolutely no agency at all. So I want to also show what happens to women when they are not given any power in their lives, what happens to them, how they might turn on each other. And this is what I think Parvati is doing. When women are frustrated by the lack of agency, I think that this is oftentimes shown in other parts of their lives. They can't turn on the men because the men have all the power, so they will turn on women. So I think that really was my sort of impetus for getting all of these characters started. And then I also love imperfect characters. So this is why all of my characters, they do good things, but they may also do things that are self-destructive. They may also do things that betray other people, because we're all like that. None of us is perfect. We all do things that are not 100% fabulous all the time. And I want my characters to be reflective of real people, because it's in the reality of people that we find the humanity, right? We find ways in which they redeem themselves after doing something that they shouldn't have done. So I love all of these explorations of different characters and how they may be good and bad and maybe sometimes ugly.
In fact, when you talked about your mother and the choices that she had and she gave you, I wanted to say lots of women hear you, Alka. we know what you're saying. Yeah. Avinuo, now about your women. Your women draw a lot of respect and awe from us as well, because many are in poverty and they do not have choices as well. And they, especially the girls who get abused by elderly person in the family. I think it's a universal problem. I don't think it's region limited or anything for the region. And the first one, the power to forgive, has a powerful line that when this girl was raped by the elderly uncle, and because the family will get a bad name, the father comes to her in the night and tells that I have decided to forgive your uncle. And this girl, though she's too young to understand, she says, you're deciding as though you are the victim. And that was a very powerful sentence for me. And she, in her mind, when she replays that abuse, her father's face merges with the uncle's. In a way, like if you're hiding and covering up for the abuser, you are also abusing. You made it come out very powerfully. And there is this little girl who tries to tell her mother that the maths tutor is touching her and she cannot. And there are other intimate relationships which are very interesting about Uncle Peter and Vivi. You wrote that they were orphaned brother and sister, and the brother could never come to terms. He was in love with the sister and he could never come to terms that she was married to someone else. These are beautiful stories that you bring in. And other strong, very interesting women are Mete and her mother. And this girl gets lost in the forest for days together, but she doesn't know where she has gone and how the mother goes after her and tries to search for her. There are innumerable stories like that in your collection where you bring out women. There is a bit of melancholy and poverty, but they come out as strong. And they are the ones who hold the family together. Even the Zabu's wife, he goes for years and years to fight for the resistance, and she brings up the children. So would you like to enlighten us more about how and where did you pick these from, and how did you make it into this interesting narratives, please?
First and foremost, just very generic. I've always really believed in the greatness of ordinary people and the resilience of the human spirit. So I often sketch my characters, male or female, around this core belief. Regarding women characters, incidentally, the part to forgive about the rape victim and the question of forgiveness, that was actually inspired by a real life incident. You know, years back, I think it was in 2011 or 12, I read this little news item about a young girl, a minor, who had been raped, but the focus was on the father and how, I mean, sort of praising the father for forgiving the rapist, and that really disturbed me on so many different levels. You know, and I thought about this issue of forgiveness and how first and foremost, it's violence must always be addressed, you know, before forgiveness takes place. So that was based on that was sort of inspired by a real life incident, and it was very cathartic for me in a way. And in general, you know, in our patriarchal Naga society, like most other male-dominated societies, women are seen as vulnerable, particularly women without a male protector in their lives. So that would mean widows or orphans, who I write about, domestic helpers. They are seen as, you know, regarded as easy prey for exploitation and the most vulnerable section of the society. And while that may be so, I don't see them as pitiable figures. I mean, they are obviously so much more than that. And these characters that you mentioned, Mete and the Beast and the widow and her child, or the little girl, you know, the domestic helper, or all that. I mean, they are, I've sketched them sort of like inspired by real women I see around me. I don't necessarily know them, but you know, and this is not to be condescending, you know, like not like putting them on a pedestal. I mean, we are all human beings, we are all flawed. But you know, the idea of a widow or a single mother, you know, doing her best to raise her children, or a young girl, maybe a domestic helper, you know, still managing to find little joys in life despite, I find it very moving. And I think I mean, these are everyday heroes and evocative of the resilience of the human spirit. So I sort of, imagine what their life might be like, and of course take a lot of creative liberty as well, infusing hope despite the melancholy, as you said. So yeah, and I don't know whether got.
Yeah. You did answer my question, and I do admire those characters. That's why I mentioned them. Like that girl who was like almost a domestic slave. She's left in somebody else's house to take care of the children of her own age. And yeah, you wrote beautifully about that. And now, Alka, you wrote about beauty and designs and everything, but also you wrote about the underbelly of that society. You wrote about the corruption in real estate, which is a huge problem since independence probably, and about gold smuggling those days, which comes from the foothills of the Himalayas into Jaipur. And it grows into a thriller from this account of a woman who's coming to make herself a life there. And you explored that as well. Can you explain a little more about that, please?
My family used to go to Shimla for the holidays, for the summer, because it was so hot in Rajasthan. And so I remember what Shimla was like. I also remember the nomads who would come down for, to accomplish something. Maybe they were purchasing something, maybe they were selling something. And I remember how they looked differently from, everybody else. They dressed differently. They had a different bearing about them. And of course, they were darker than everybody because they spent so much time out in the sun. And I was always fascinated by them. So when it came time to write The Secret Keeper of Jaipur, I actually had a scene come to my mind. And that was one of these young nomadic women who was on the Shimla pedestrian mall. And she was selling her herbal plants and flowers that she had collected from the higher elevations. And then I saw the characters of Malik and Lakshmi grown up, and they were coming down into the mall to meet her and to see what she had for sale. So then I was very curious about what a young woman would be doing selling her wares on the Shimla Mall as if she's established there, because really what she should be doing is being with her nomadic tribe, going back up into the mountains again. So I started researching these tribes, and I found so many different kind of tribes that live in the Himalayas, and they still do. And they still make those treks up and down the mountains because they have herds of sheep and goat and water buffalo. And they also have a very strong oral tradition, like Avinuo was saying, and they don't have anything written down. So everything I had to glean from reports that other people have written about them. National Geographic had embedded a reporter with them one time, and there was a wonderful article that I could glean a lot of information from. So they were just fascinating to me, that they live off the land, that they take care of themselves, that they have their own, medical remedies, because they're probably going to get hurt up in the mountains and there's nobody to help them. And then also, I love the fact that they are very proud people. They're illiterate largely because they don't have schools that they can be consistently taught in all year round, because they're constantly moving. So even though Nimmi, the character in The Secret Keeper of Jaipur, is 22, 23 years old, she doesn't know how old she is because, of course, there's no birth records are kept. But she is a proud woman. And even though Lakshmi is a little bit upset about the fact that she does not have an education and Malik is still interested in her, she does not know her letters. She does not know, how to read. But Nimmi is still portrayed in the novel as a very proud woman. She is not thinking that she is less than just because she doesn't have that education that Lakshmi does. So I wanted to definitely portray that. And I wanted to talk about another segment of society in India that doesn't get a lot of recognition, doesn't get talked about, and I find them so fascinating. So just like you were saying also in your stories, that these are people that you just are fascinated by, and they have these stories to tell, and I think if they are gone, if they are suddenly eradicated, we will not have those stories anymore. I want to be able to preserve some of those stories as well.
And the realistic, the theater comes down on a Bollywood.
Yeah. And I talked to my dad about that. I said, Dad, when a building in Rajasthan falls down, who pays for it? Who takes responsibility? Here in the West, you would have 100 lawsuits immediately, and people would be clamoring for money. But what happened in India in the 1960s, which is when the Secret Keeper takes place? And he told me that, the people who actually build will take responsibility. They will help the families of those who are hurt in some kind of a tragedy, like the Royal Jewel Cinema, which falls, the balcony falls on opening night. And I think that, Dad was so, informative about what was happening and the legal recourse and all of that at that time. I didn't know that's where the story was going to go, but it's just where the characters were leading me. And then the whole thing about the nomads and how they get conscripted into carrying gold for the contraband gold that's coming in from the north down into the central part of India. That was really fascinating to me. And I found a way to sort of combine those two those two stories together, and in The Secret Keeper. And the other thing about it is that I've always been fascinated by why India is so focused on gold. Why is everybody having to wear 22, 24 karat gold? Why is it so important to do that? I remember having fights with my mother here in the United States because I wanted to wear silver. I went gray very early, and I just thought silver looked better with my complexion and my hair. And my mom would say, no, you should wear pure gold. Pure gold is the way to, and I would say, why? Why, Mom? Why? And she didn't really have an answer for me, because that was the way that, she had been trained to think about metal, that if it's really pure, no one can take it away from you. People can't just, it can't just burn up in a fire. And so it was security for my mother. That was security. That was retirement. That was everything that she could rely upon in hard times. And so I wanted to write about that obsession with gold that India has as well. Even though so little of the gold is mined in India, they still, demand it. The family still demand it. The family still give it for dowries and so on.
Avinuo, coming to you, the one story that really made an effect on me was that of a boy from Nagaland who comes to Delhi to study, and how people treat him as an alien, as an outsider. We hear this a lot, that our own people coming from marginalized parts of India, where we don't give them it's not inclusive, let's say. The society is not as inclusive as it should be. And this boy sees a red shirt in a cheap shop, a t-shirt with Chinese writing, and he starts wearing it. Just so that people accept him as a Chinese tourist, and so he can get away. That was a very, there is humor, but you touched, I feel a little ashamed that you had to write that. Could you please talk about what is felt from your people, that how do you feel and what can be done about it? Definitely more stories, more participation in Mysuru Literature Festival from your side will do that. But we want to know your point of view. What do you think should be done to be more inclusive and less suspicious of what we humans do generally?
I think me, being an educator, being a teacher, for me, it's always like education first. Like our education system it has to be more inclusive. India is, is a country with so much racial, and ethnic diversity. It's a country of multiple narratives. So there's always the danger of, a single story eclipsing the histories and stories of minority groups. And so I think it begins with, it has to start from the education system, where it has to be more inclusive, incorporating the histories and culture of minority smaller groups of people, and also sharing stories. What we're doing now, literature, I'm writing stories. My stories are tales with a strong Naga base, and reading about each other's stories. That way we sort of like, I think sharing stories is the best way to integrate people and cultures. And when I say integrate, I don't necessarily mean homogenizing people groups into like one singular whole, but but to be able to understand and appreciate each other's differences. And when we do that, that's when we find more common ground to build upon. And yeah, so, and especially identity crisis, it's such a it's become a social issue. It's such a real thing. I mean, a problem for young people, and especially Nagas or other Northeast groups as well. And they come to the city, and that confusion, it increases when your passport says you're Indian, but then other mainstream people, I mean, they see you and they think Chinese or some Asian race. So it creates, I think, especially for young people, when they are not very confident about their identity, then it becomes, it creates a lot of identity crisis. And so in that particular story, Nigu, the protagonist, is a young boy and obviously a bit lost, and then he goes to the city, and suddenly he's faced with this crisis that builds and builds. And so he ends up, the t-shirt that he bought with the Chinese lettering and script on it, he sort of like projects an alternate identity onto the shirt. So it's, you're right in saying it's meant to be symbolic. Yeah.
I would also add that not only bringing the stories and getting your stories translated into other Indian languages so that it goes to other people would be a very good idea, so that we know that there are stories out there and there are people out there who are similar and different. And that's the big...
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought up translations. I absolutely agree that translations are the key to share stories to a wider audience, and so that they can be widely appreciated. And actually in this regard, I've always felt that translators do not get enough credit as they should. Because good translators, they further enrich the story and add to the story. So yeah.
Yeah. I think I have finished my questions, but I see a lot of questions out there. And before I go to that, I have to ask Alka. Alka, you said you have already done 700 interviews. And that was a few days ago, you said, probably by now. Also, your stories have been picked for, your novels have been picked for a Netflix serial. And we would like to know, and Frida Pinto, who acted in Slumdog Millionaire, that's how we know her. She's acting in it. So can you talk a little bit about that? How did you adapt the story to a screenplay? Are they changing it a lot? By then I will choose also the questions that is coming here. Yeah.
One of the first things that the Hollywood wants to know is if your book is being translated. We were just talking about translation. If it's being translated into multiple languages, and the Henna Artist was translated into 23 different languages all around the world. So then they knew that this could be a global product. They knew that the screen adaptation could be globally appealing. And so what happened is that production companies started calling me. Well, I am not a screenwriter. I'm not a Hollywood person. So I had to get screen management representation in Hollywood. And they actually managed the process of all the proposals that came in. And one of the first things they asked me is, do you want the Henna Artist to be a TV series, or do you want it to be a movie? And I said, oh, I've got so many layers of things that are happening in the Henna Artist. There is a whole historical layer of that time period. There is the all the characters and all the different classes of characters. And then we've got the whole art of henna and the medical, the medicinal remedies and so on. So I don't want a 90-minute movie that is not going to do justice to all those layers. I would like to really have a bingeable TV show that shows on one of these streaming channels. And so my management company said, okay, great. That's what we will tell everybody you want. I said, I get to determine that. And they said, yeah, you get to tell people what you want for your show. So then I got to zoom in with all of the different proposals. And I chose the proposal that I thought would have the most integrity and that would treat this material with the most respect and move it forward into a real production. Most of the things that get optioned do not make it into production. And that is because production requires so much work. There are hundreds of people involved before something actually gets produced as a movie or a TV series, right? And you guys know this. So I chose Michael Edelstein, who was the lead producer. And when he saw the henna artist, he said, we could make this into an Indian Downton Abbey. Now that was gold to my ears. That was music to my ears, because Downton Abbey has been seen around the world as something that people can really, admire, fall back on. It's a lush production and so on. And so I love the fact that Michael wanted to turn the henna artist into something very lush and something that could be seen around the world and appreciated. And I really want people to appreciate the South Asian culture in all of its glory, but also in all of its nuanced sort of nastiness. I just want everybody to appreciate it. And so he was appreciating it in that way. He is friends with Frida Pinto. They both go to ashrams in India together. And so he said, Frida, I'm going to send you this manuscript. He did. And she said, not only do I want to portray Lakshmi, but I also want to executive produce this with you. He said, great. So then he went to his first look deal with Miramax TV and said, I would really like to produce this. And they were on board. So that was the team that I sold my option to. And then since then, it's been about, I think, 18 months since they bought the option. And they have kept me apprised every step of the way. Here is what's happening now. Here's who we're talking to. Here is the showrunners that we're looking at. Here are the scripts, here are the writers that we're looking at to populate the writer's room. So it's been a really fabulous journey for me because I'm learning along the way how something like this gets produced. And then finally, when they started pitching it to streaming companies, they pitched it to Netflix and Netflix said yes. So that was really wonderful. So it's in development now, and hopefully we will be, COVID notwithstanding, we will be filming in Jaipur in late 2022 or early 2023. So that's the plan. I have met the writers, and one of my major requirements of Michael was, please populate the writer's room with mostly female and mostly South Asian. This is a South Asian story. I am tired of South Asian stories being told by colonizers or by the other, and I want the stories to be told authentically by people who are actually from that area. And so he has stayed true to his word. 90% of the writer's room is South Asian, and 80% of the writer's room is female. So I just think that this is so important. And so far, he has kept true to everything he told me he was going to do. So I have no doubt that he will stay also true to the story as we move forward.
I see a lot of questions from the audience, and we will take a couple of them as much as the time permits. Avinuo, I'll combine two questions for you and ask you here. One is, Avinuo, what would be your next literary expression after short stories and poetry, a novel or a play? And the other one, Avinuo, how do you balance the responsibility of being a conduit for real people's oral stories while giving yourself the freedom for creating explorations?
Okay, all right. So the first, I'll take the first question first. I am actually currently, experimenting and trying to go beyond the short story. So yeah, just stay tuned, please. Yeah. Yeah, I'm experimenting a bit, so I'm trying to my hands at other genres of literature, definitely. So definitely, yeah. And regarding responsibility, responsibility, that's always such a heavy loaded word, and it's not how creative writing works, certainly. So when it comes to oral narratives, I don't necessarily document stories or take my inspiration from these oral narratives because I feel a sense of responsibility. Really, I'm really inspired by them, and I'm moved by them. So yeah.
And they may not be talking about their biographies, right? Sometimes oral narratives may be stories as well, their own fiction.
Yes. So yeah, because folk narratives, they're always a rich reservoir of knowledge about a people, and I'm always so interested in people's stories, and they inspire me. So creativity and all that, they all sort of like blend. And the community, writing, it's such a complex exercise where we are blending the personal and the shared experience and individual and community. So I find they all sort of like come together beautifully. So yeah.
Yeah, the division sort of blurs and the mix up. Yes.
Yeah, it's sort of weird. Yeah, so I don't really have never really thought about that. Really, yeah.
I understand that. Alka, there is a question for you. We learned that you have been traveling in Europe to research for the second sequel. Can we get a glimpse on what is to come?
Sure. And, just as with every novel, I'm trying to show another facet of South Asian culture. In number 3, what I'm trying to show is the very expansive diaspora of South Asians, that we have traveled to every and really settled in every part of the world. And I think this is something that comes as a surprise to people who are not familiar with our culture. So in book number 3, Radha, who was only 13 years old and the henna artist, as Lakshmi's sister, who just comes upon her out of the blue. Now she is a perfumer in Paris, and the year is 1974. So I get to talk a lot about 1974 and what was happening in that era around the world. But also she's married to a Parisian. That's how she ended up in Paris. And she's on the cusp of designing a signature scent when somebody from her past is going to knock on her door and say, hey, I haven't seen you in 18 years. I want to know who you are. And so that is going to be a big shock in her life. The other thing that's going to happen in book number 3 is that Radha, in order to develop the perfume that she is wanting to develop, she actually has to go to India to find some of the scents. And what I want the world to know in book number 3 is that so many of the base notes that go into a perfume are found in India, and they have been harvested in India. They have been used from India for centuries. And, I just want the world also then to appreciate this other part of South Asian culture that they may not know about. For example, where does sandalwood oil come from? Where does vetiver come from? Where does the tuberose that goes into a lot of perfumes come from? Where's the best jasmine? These scents are very heavy, and they are all incorporated, even in minuscule form, in most perfumes, and they come from India. So I want to be able to explore that in book number 3. So what I was doing in Paris is talking to a lot of master perfumers, and then I went down to Grasse, which is in the southeastern area of France, and that's where a lot of the perfumes were manufactured. That's really where the industry first started. So I talked to some compounders in that area, and just really soaked up that atmosphere that Radha is going to be in book number 3.
Wonderful. And you mentioned sandalwood, and Mysuru is very famous for sandalwood. You
Yes.
have to bring your research here.
Yeah. The sandalwood in India was being mined, was being harvested too much. And so the government actually had to put limits on how much sandalwood could be taken out of India and used by all of these various perfumers, because a sandalwood tree takes about 35 years to grow. And they were just being chopped down without being without being what's it called?
Deforested, replanted.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Avinuo, there is a question for you. You have co-authored a book of oral narratives of the Naga people. The treasure of our culture folklore is passed on orally. How was the experience of recording that treasure? People are fascinated with your recording the oral tradition. And to that, I want to ask something else. if some of us or some of the listeners want to travel to Nagaland, because the forests you have written are so beautiful that people would visit, how is the situation? How would we travel, or how is that situation? I would like you to mix up both and answer me, please.
No, please visit Nagaland. It's such a beautiful place, so such a varied landscape, and it's you can come by flight, by train. There's all modes of transport, and it's perfectly safe. It's so please visit. And this year too, we have the annual Hornbill Festival coming up, and it's always such a vibrant display of cultures, and it's getting bigger and better. So so that's always a great time to visit during the Hornbill Festival, which is from the 1st to this time, because of the pandemic. It's sort of it's usually from the 1st to 9th, but I think they've sort of like cut short the period this time. But that's always a nice time to visit. And what was about people's stories? It was such an enriching, educative learning experience for me, because I started out, as I mentioned earlier, I've always been fascinated by these stories, but I knew very little myself about my own culture in the process of listening to these stories. And for us, our oral narratives, it's not these are not just stories told for entertainment. They explain why things are the way they are. They explain about the Naga way of life. So it was such an enriching experience for me, and I feel so privileged because and especially because my generation is the last generation to be linked to the final elderly generation who have actually lived through the oral tradition, who are actually professional storytellers. So since my generation is the last, I feel this sense of urgency in documenting the stories and writing them down while these oral narrators are alive. And also, so this urgency, and also I feel truly privileged to be able to write their stories. So they're very enriching.
Just if I may ask, is the language spoken in Kohima and the cities similar to the language spoken by those oral people who narrate orally, or do you have to learn a different language or a different kind of dialect to understand them?
No, I mean, Nagaland, we have, 16 tribes and then sub-tribes, and we all have, we are so linguistically rich, and so many languages, and every tribe, every community, they have their own oral narrators. So so you find,
so you need to take a translator.
I need to get a translator, but I have like oral narrators I'm Angami, my tribe, that's my tribe. So language, sometimes it becomes a barrier because we have so many different tribes with distinct language of our own. So one drawback is that so far I've sort of limited this documentation of stories to oral narrators within my own community. And, I'm also trying to sort of like spread a wider net and meet oral narrators from other tribes, other communities as well. But for that, I would need a translator or an interpreter. Yeah.
I hope you will record all those stories. Which
I plan to, yes.
And before we close, may I request both of you to read a passage or a poetry, Avinuo, and a passage from your favorite passage, Alka. Avinuo, could you read as a poetry first, please?
With pleasure.
Yeah, please. You want me to go first?
Please.
I was going alphabetically, so.
Okay. All right. Okay. So this is from chapter 1, and this sort of sets the stage. Jaipur, state of Rajasthan, India, November 15th, 1955. Independence changed everything. Independence changed nothing. 8 years after the British left, we now had free government schools, running water, and paved roads. But Jaipur still felt the same to me as it had 10 years ago, the first time I stepped foot on its dusty soil. On the way to our first appointment of the morning, Malik and I nearly collided with a man carrying cement bags on his head when a bicycle cut between us. The cyclist, hugging a 6-foot ladder under his arm, caused a horse carriage to sideswipe a pig who ran squealing into a narrow alley. At one point, we stepped aside and waited for a raucous band of hijras to pass. The sari-clad, lipstick-wearing men were singing and dancing in front of a house to bless the birth of a baby boy. So accustomed were we to the odors of the city, cow dung, cooking fires, coconut hair oil, sandalwood, incense, and urine, that we barely noticed them. What independence had changed was our people. You could see it in the way they stood, chest puffed, as if they could finally allow themselves to breathe. You saw it in the way they walked, purposefully, pridefully, to their temples. The way they haggled more boldly than before with the vendors in the bazaar.
Very nice.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Avinuo.
Since Alka has read prose, I'm going to choose poetry. So this is a poem I wrote many years back in school, actually, and it's about its own nostalgia, and it's called Memories of a Rose. I've seen you before, many lives ago. Your soft pink petals. In that dream, you clung, your green and thorns, over rusted gates. I remember you, your soft engaging blooms, turning a dilapidated house into a sweet childhood memory. Yeah, thank you.
So beautiful. Now you must teach us how to say thank you in Naga dialect or your tribe's dialect. We should learn at least
My
say Alka, isn't it?
My mother tongue, my native dialect is Tinidie. So in Tinidie, thank you is Mpije. Mpije.
PJ. PJ is thank you. Yes. And PJ is very nice. I say PJ to all of you. And Alka, I want to tell you about Madho Singh. Madho Singh is Maharani Indira's pet Alexandrian parakeet. And it says, hello, good evening, bonjour, in French as well, right? So I should have started with that and ended with J. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, both of you. It was a wonderful.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for having us. This is really wonderful.
To you now.
It was such an informative and power-packed. You know, it's 3 women. It's not easy. So they were such a and beautiful women. If I can say, the session kept us hooked, and we all have become so much more richer with the information from both your sides. And at our book club, already many members have started downloading both your books. So very soon we are going to be discussing your books, and then maybe we will send you one small report also. Okay. And thank you both for accepting our invitation to be here, and hope to see you both in Mysuru. And Alka, whenever you're in India, try to call on us. And Jayashree, you carried the session very beautifully. And
thank you, PJ. And we will see you in Mysuru.
Yeah. And thanks to all our viewers. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. we have a walk on the wild side by Senani and Krupakar, the wildlife photographers. You will get to listen to them and the wonderful work they're doing to our own Mysuru people. Thank you both so much again.
Good night.
Bye.
Namaskara.
Good night.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Thank you. That was so wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
I know.
And I loved hearing about Avinuo's short stories. I'm really tempted now to find them and read them.